Yes, so I'm Tiffany Kohler. I work for EPA here in Washington, D.C. in the Office of Resource Conservation and Recovery. I'm going to give a little bit of a WARM 101, so just kind of a short tutorial on what WARM is, why we use it. I'll also go into a little bit about updates, but not too deep into that, hoping that most of you have used it once or twice. So WARM
Tiffany, we've had a request for the screen to be larger. Is there any way for you to do that on your end? Enlarge the screen.
Let me see. I don't know. It doesn't seem to. Let me. Is that any bigger?
No, it's about the same.
Okay. Doesn't look like it's going any big. Zoom in. Nope.
No. Okay. That's
Sorry.
fine. Sorry to interrupt you.
It's okay. So WARM was created in 1998. It was created to really help solid waste planners and organizations track and report greenhouse gas emissions from different waste management practices. When we first started it, it was kind of, really just kind of comparing landfill to recycling for common things like paper and aluminum cans. We've really been able to expand that. As you can see, we now have 54 materials from paper to plastic to organics. And in that, we now have source reduction, recycling, combustion, composting, anaerobic digestion, and landfilling. So it's a much more robust tool than when we started in 1998. Our version 14 really was the launch for anaerobic digestion, and that new wave of hopefully we can continue to add waste management practices. For that, the model calculates emissions in a couple of different ways. So you can look at metric tons of carbon equivalent, metric tons of carbon dioxide equivalent, as well as energy units. So you can have GHG savings as well as energy savings when using the model. One of the things that anyone that has used the model before has known is that we used to have two formats for WARM. So we used to have an online version that really incorporated national assumptions with limited inputs from a user. And then when we had the Excel version that allowed users to choose where they were in the country, so for landfill conditions, E-grid characteristics, etc. Unfortunately, as many of you may have noticed, when we launched our new website in April, we're not able to support the online calculator anymore due to our new web platform. We're really hoping that we'll be able to bring that back in the future, but for right now, our Excel spreadsheet is the only available use of WARM. A little more about WARM. And so WARM is a national tool. It's based on data that represents the national average and common practices across the country. It's a question we get a lot as to why do we not have regionally specific information in there. And it really is meant to be what represents occurring practices and best GHG savings associated with those practices for any part. We use a life cycle approach for all of our material categories. So it's not a full life cycle analysis, but we try to look at all factors that contribute to the material. So for food, for an example, maybe growth, or for aluminum and other things, mining through manufacturing, and ultimately to waste disposal. WARM does allow a user to choose some level of location-specific information, as I had mentioned before, E-grid and landfill characteristics. So it does allow you to customize some components of that and really allow you to try to hone in a little bit more on what might be specific to your part of the world. But overall, WARM really tries to make the national average the way to go and make it easiest on the user to not have to make those assumptions or have that amount of knowledge, having it really there for them. As part of our WARM tool, we try to make sure that people really are able to have access to the information that is in WARM. And in that, we have two pieces of that. We have our documentation chapters as well as our WARM model history. Our documentation chapters allow a user to understand the information behind each of our options, so whether it be in the materials or our waste management options. Such things as offsets and emissions from acquisition to end of life, but also what limitations and assumptions were made for each of those materials and practices are also in our documentation chapters, because we want people to understand what really is going into that, and maybe something you thought would be there isn't there, or something you didn't think about is there. So it's really trying to let you see that full picture as the user of what you're working with. Our worm model history allows for you to be able to see how we've changed things throughout. So from version 1 all the way to version 14, you will see the improvements that have been made, anything that we have added, changed, gotten rid of, if there wasn't good data out there for it. So really trying to let someone be able to see that history. It's also important for someone who potentially downloads the Excel spreadsheet, something you can keep on your computer for a long time and not realize that any changes have been made. So we really want people to be able to have that and know that that update has occurred and that there may be information that might be more helpful to them at that time. To get into a little bit more of what we have recently done, we have been working probably for the last couple of years now on organics and the updates to that. Before this, we had yard waste, we had food scraps for composting, but it was a very limited section of WARM, and we've been spending the last 2 or 3 years now really expanding it with a national focus on food and EPA, as well as just something that you're seeing more prevalent in the news and people talking about. It really was something we wanted to expand and make more robust within the model itself. So in these recent updates, we have expanded our organics food waste section to include food waste meat, which is poultry and beef, food waste non-meat, which is fruits and vegetables, dairy and grain. And then we have our mixed food waste category, and that represents an average of mixed food over something that maybe we aren't currently modeling, like pork or fish. And as part of these updates, we've expanded the waste management options for organics handling to include source reduction, anaerobic digestion, composting, combustion, and landfilling. To get into a little bit more detail about the anaerobic digestion piece, we wanted to let you all know that we're really happy here today to talk about version 14 of WARM that includes that addition of anaerobic digestion. Bobby, in a couple minutes, will really cover in depth what we did in that category, what it is, but just for a high-level overview, we wanted to let you all know. It took about 1.5 years to develop this category, and we had input from the American Biogas Council, academia, experts in the field, and many EPA colleagues. This input led us to our AD category that includes default assumptions around wet digestion. It also features our category also features a toggle that instructs the user to choose dry digestion for yard trimmings and allows the user to make a choice between wet or dry digestion for food waste. We recognize that this may not meet everyone's needs that are anaerobically digesting their organic waste, but we are trying to, again, represent the national average in that and really make sure that what we see as the prevalent practice across the country is being represented. But as part of that, and really what we started looking at when we realized that, was that we wanted to have that next phase. And you'll see here on this slide that our next planned update is an organics module. And in this module, we're really looking at a subset of the WARM model that will only cover organic materials and the waste management options associated with it. Additional features that this can include will be food donation. It is something that we have wanted to add to our model for some time, and open fields for user input. So you can choose different things about maybe what kind of anaerobic digester you're using. So maybe for co-digestion, how is the digestate being used? Maybe how is the compost being used? And different things like distance to facilities and other components of that. So we look forward to this model. We do hope that sometime by the end of this year, early next year, we will have that up there, and it will allow that user to take that next step in customizing WARM for their needs. I'll now turn this over to Bobby and let him discuss some of the data and assumptions that were used to build our anaerobic digestion category.
All right, great. Thank you, Tiffany. All right, is everyone able to hear me okay? Pulling up my slide deck now.
Can hear you fine.
Okay, great, thank you. All right, and let me know if the slides are looking okay. But yeah, thank you. Thanks, Tiffany, and thank you, Terry, for the introduction. As Tiffany mentioned, I'll be talking through the organic materials management options in WARM in more detail, and specifically the anaerobic digestion pathway that we added most recently. I work for ICF International and been working with Tiffany to update and develop the WARM model for a number of years, and we're really excited about some of the recent updates and happy to be able to talk through them with you today. So just to start off here, a quick outline of what we'll be discussing. I'll be going through the organic materials and management practices in WARM in a little more detail. Tiffany already provided an introduction to them. And then from there, going into probably the most detail on the new anaerobic digestion pathway within WARM, so talking through the modeling approach, the different sources of emissions and offsets that we've modeled, and then the results for the emission factors for different materials. And then from there, I'll provide a brief overview of the other organics management practices, so source reduction, composting, and landfilling. After that, a results comparison across the different organics management practices. And then we'll be talking about food donation, how current options for modeling it, and more forward-looking what we plan to do in the future. And finally, talking in a bit more detail about the organics module that Tiffany just mentioned. So just starting off about organics in WARM and what we really mean when we refer to it. This is a group of municipal solid waste materials in WARM that are predominantly derived from plants. This includes food waste, yard trimmings, and mixed organics, which is a mix of food waste and yard trimmings. Organics, as we consider them in WARM, excludes paper products, and the reason we sort of think of organics, group them together here, is due to their properties, they are different waste materials management options compared to other municipal solid waste materials. Like, for example, probably the biggest difference is that organics can't be recycled in a traditional sense the way other materials like paper, plastics, glass can be. So that's why it's helpful to think about them differently, and there's different management practices that we're going to be covering here today. So this table provides an overview of how we manage the different organics materials groupings for the different management practices in WARM. So I'm going to just provide a quick overview for each of the rows that covers the different management practices. And if you've used WARM before, you probably know that the materials, this is slightly turned from how it's presented in WARM, where materials will be presented vertically with a row for each material, and then you put in your tons for each column for the different management practices. So that's sort of the dimensions we're talking about here. Starting off with source reduction, and source reduction was most recently added for food waste, and source reduction representing avoided energy and emissions from preventing waste from being generated in the first place, and avoiding the production of materials. So, for example, for food waste, this could involve in a cafeteria switching to tray-free dining, which allows you to purchase less food, generate less waste, and then the source reduction pathway, when compared to the baseline, is meant to capture avoided emissions from source reducing those food products. So that's modeled in WARM for all the specific food waste types that we'll be talking about in just a second. It's not modeled for yard trimmings or mixed organics, mainly because there's not sufficient data to really know for the yard trimmings fraction, what are all the inputs that go into producing yard trimmings before they become a waste product. Next is anaerobic digestion. This is modeled for all organics materials. We'll be talking in detail most about this today. And it's for food waste, it's based on an average of all food waste types, so not modeled specifically for each exact food material. For yard trimmings and mixed organics, we have data specific to grass, leaves, and branches, which are the yard trimmings components modeled in WARM. Composting, again, covers all organic materials. Here we have for food waste, we have a weighted average mix of food waste properties that we use to model it. For yard trimmings, similarly, we have weighted average mix of green waste, so that's the grass, leaves, branches combination. Combustion, modeled similarly as well for all organic materials. And for landfilling, again, we model landfilling impacts from all organics. For yard trimmings, we have specific properties for grass, leaves, and branches. For food waste, we assume average food waste properties for all food materials. And finally, donation. This is not currently included within the WARM spreadsheet model. We have a guidance document available that provides some information on how you could estimate the avoided landfilling emissions if you were to donate food instead of landfilling it. But we're currently developing a more detailed process likely to be part of the organics module that will capture sort of the full donation process and more than just avoided landfilling impacts. So this is an overview of the organic materials in WARM. The three major groupings that you can see here, food waste, yard trimmings, and mixed organics, are shown. For food waste, we have each row really represents a row that's within WARM. So we have an average food waste factor, and that's a weighted average based on a weighted average of all of the specific food types that are shown below. And this is meant to represent the national average mix of food materials that are in the municipal solid waste stream. This was developed from data in the USDA's Loss Adjusted Food Availability Report to get the latest data we have on the weightings of different food materials within the food waste stream. Then we have groupings for food waste, non-meat, and for meat only. And again, these are weighted average mix of the more specific materials below. So for non-meat, that's grains, fruits and vegetables, and dairy products. And then for meat only, that would be the weighted average of beef and poultry. And then just to quickly go through each of the materials, we have beef, poultry, which assumes broiler chicken, grains, that's based on a weighted average of corn, wheat, and rice, the three biggest grain products produced in the U.S. For bread, we assume bread produced from wheat grain. Fruits and vegetables, we considered some of the most common fruits and vegetables that enter the waste stream within the U.S. And similarly for dairy products, it's weighted average of the largest share of different dairy products produced. As we mentioned, these specific food types are most relevant for the source reduction pathway, where we've modeled the upstream impacts of producing different food types. But for most of the other waste management practices, we assume an average mix of food waste properties. So really, that top row is sort of how all food waste are modeled for the other management practices. Next, for yard trimmings, we have a yard trimmings factor. That's a weighted average of grass, leaves, and branches. And then you can also model, if you have more specific data, you can model grass, leaves, and branches separately within WARM. And then finally, mixed organics. This is a weighted average mix of food waste and yard trimmings. This is based on the most recent EPA data and the Facts and Figures Municipal Solid Waste Report. And it's right now, and for a while, it's been roughly about 50-50 mix of food waste and yard trimmings. So now jumping into anaerobic digestion. Anaerobic digestion as a new material management option within WARM was added this spring as part of WARM version 14. And anaerobic digestion, or AD as I might refer to it, is this is a facility that generates biogas through the anaerobic degradation of organic materials in an engineered environment. So what that basically means is that organic materials are put into a reactor, a vessel, and it really behaves similarly to landfilling, where they degrade over time in this anaerobic environment and produce biogas. But the advantages of anaerobic digestion is it happens quicker than landfilling and in a much more controlled environment. So you can have more control over what goes in and out of the system. The materials are digested and they produce biogas that's assumed to be about 50 to 70% methane, and the rest is mainly CO2. The CO2 that's produced we assume to be biogenic, which is to say it would have been produced if the materials had degraded naturally. So that is not, any of the biogenic CO2 is not considered within WARM, which is a practice that's carried over through other pathways like composting and landfilling, where we don't account for biogenic CO2 emissions from the degradation of organic materials. And then the resulting, the biogas is captured, and then the resulting solid and liquid digestates, which are the materials that are left over, those have to be recovered or treated and wherever possible beneficially used. So just to go over some of the challenges to modeling anaerobic digestion in worm, it's a rapidly growing materials management practice, and so that sort of makes it difficult to model the national average in worm. And as Tiffany talked about, we really do try to make worm a national tool. And knowing that AD is growing rapidly, it's we did our best to try to model it as it would be relevant for a national audience, knowing that practices are gonna really vary based on the markets that you have for the organic materials and what comes out of it. And so we'll be talking about some of the challenges there, and hopefully providing some more options in the organics module as we develop it. So starting with the biogas, it can be beneficially utilized in a number of different ways. One option is burned on site for electricity or heat generation. You put it in an internal combustion engine and it can produce heat or electricity, similar to what's commonly done with landfill gas. Another option would be to upgrade it to vehicle fuel or to upgrade it to pipeline quality natural gas. Similarly, the solid and liquid digestates have to be recovered and treated. There's other ways of managing them as well. We'll be talking about how we treated the digestates in worm in just a second, but there are a number of options there, really depending on what type of feedstocks you have, what's coming out of the system, and what kind of markets you have for those materials. And finally, there's a lot of different possible configurations of anaerobic digestion facilities. So you could have a standalone system, or very commonly there are co-digestion options. So we're looking at anaerobic digestion of food waste and yard trimmings, which are municipal solid waste materials, but non-municipal solid waste materials like manures and wastewater treatment sludge are often digested as well. So in many cases, food waste and yard trimmings might be co-digested with those materials. So there are co-digestion options that are very common. And then there are wet systems versus dry systems, which we'll be talking more about in just a second. So this diagram provides an overview of our modeling approach. The model that is in worm was based on a model developed by Drs. Morton Barlatz and James Levis at North Carolina State University, and we worked with them to adapt it from their SWOLF model, which is a life cycle assessment model for different material management practices. On the diagram here, this is just sort of like a quick flow overview of how the process works. The blue boxes indicate stages that are a source of greenhouse gas emissions, so have positive emissions. The green boxes indicate stages where greenhouse gas emissions are avoided, so they have negative emissions. So beginning on the left, which is really the point of waste generation, the point that food waste or yard trimmings become waste materials, sort of the starting point for worm. We assume that the feedstocks are transported and pre-processed before going into the reactor. So this involves grinding, screening, mixing to get them suitable to be fed into the reactor. Then once in the reactor, there's assumed to be some losses of biogas during the process, and then some fuels, electricity that are needed to run the reactor. So that is the source of emissions. Then moving upwards, the biogas is sent to as modeled in worm, sent to an internal combustion engine, and where the biogas is assumed to be combusted. We assume that there are some methane losses in that process, but also that some of the heat from the engine can be recovered and fed back into the reactor to offset any of the fuel that might be needed to keep the reactor at the appropriate heat that it needs to, the appropriate temperature that it needs to run. At the engine, we assume that the biogas is combusted, generating electricity, and then when that net electricity is used, it avoids emissions at the electricity grid. So that's why that box is green. You're generating your own electricity. You don't need to use grid electricity, which avoids emissions. So moving back down to the reactor, we've covered the biogas. What's left at the reactor is the solid digestates, and in the case of a wet digester, liquid digestates. So if it's a wet digester, we assume that it's dewatered and that the liquids are recovered and returned to the reactor. That doesn't occur if it's a dry digester. And then the digestate is then removed from the reactor, and they're transported off-site for beneficial use. The default in warm is that the digestates would be aerobically cured prior to application to agricultural soils. This involves turning the materials in windrows, followed by compost screening, and then transport to the agricultural field and application to land. The materials coming out of aerobic curing would resemble, those that commonly come out of composting process. But there is an option to exclude the aerobic curing option within warm, and so that would involve direct application of digestates to agricultural soils. From there, the digestate or the cured digestate that's in compost form is applied to land for agricultural production, and there we assume that there's carbon storage in that process, and then a nitrogen fertilizer offset occurs due to the nutrients in the digestate, allowing the farmer to avoid use of some nitrogen fertilizers. So just to talk, I think I covered some of this already, but just to talk through our modeling approach, there are two digester configuration options. The wet digester, which is continuous single-stage mesophilic digester. We assume that this accepts only food waste materials in warm. From our review of literature and talking with experts, basically it would be too energy and potentially cost-intensive to try to pre-process yard trimmings to get them suitable for degradation in a wet reactor. So we've assumed that only food waste is put into wet digesters. The methane yield that we assume for a wet digester is based on data from both standalone and co-digestion facilities. So basically, in our analysis, we assume the greenhouse gas impacts from the digestion of the individual materials as if they were digested by themselves. So even if they were co-digested, we just look at the fraction of the municipal solid waste material that's being modeled. So in that sense, we strive to make a model that's representative of both standalone and co-digestion facilities. In the future, we might try to further model those differences and any other potential benefits that might not be captured for certain co-digestion facilities, which we'll be talking about a bit further on in the presentation. We also model a dry digester. This is a single-stage mesophilic digester. It accepts all organic materials in warm, so this would be an option for food waste, yard trimmings, and mixed organics. And then, as I mentioned previously, there are two digestate treatment options. Aerobic curing before land application, which is the default, and then there's direct land application without curing. So just to provide a quick summary of what the different energy and emission sources and offsets are for anaerobic digestion. First, there's transportation of materials, getting the waste materials to the reactor, and then afterwards transporting them for land application. Then there's the pre-processing and digester operations, so any fuels needed for chipping the materials, screening them, and then eventually keeping the digester at the appropriate heat. There's fuel or electricity needed for that. Then collecting the biogas and utilizing it, assuming some methane losses in that process. And if the engine's down, you have to, assuming you'd have to flare the biogas for some small portion of the time. Curing and land application, again, some fuels are needed during that process to, for example, turning the windrows, running the equipment. We also assume that there are fugitive methane and N2O emissions that occur during the curing and land application process. And then as an offset, carbon is stored in the soil after land application. And we assume also that there are some avoided fertilizer offsets. Again, it's not a one-to-one offset where for every ton of digestate you apply, you avoid a ton of synthetic fertilizer, but we do, based on the nutrient in the digestate, we assume that some synthetic fertilizer can be offset. And finally, there's the net electricity offsets from the combusted biogas. So as you generate electricity, you can avoid grid electricity. And within WARM, this is adjustable for the regional electricity grid, which is an option we've had for a while now for combustion and for landfilling. And that's been carried over to anaerobic digestion as well, where you can use a national average grid electricity mix, or you can assume a mix more relevant for your region. So here we have an overview of the results for the wet digester. Again, this is the wet digester results only apply for food waste, and we've shown side by side the results for curing, where the digestate is cured before application, next to where the results if digestate is directly applied to land. So just going through the results here, the black square represents the net emissions. So when you account for all sources of emissions and all avoided emissions, that's the net result that comes out of it. The blue bars at the top above the x-axis show sources of emissions, so positive emissions, and the green boxes show avoided emissions from the different processes. So you can see here in terms of positive emissions, the largest share comes from process non-energy emissions. So this would be fugitive emissions of N2O and methane that occur during curing and land application. This also includes some methane leakage that occurs during from the reactor. And then looking at the avoided emissions, the largest portion comes from the avoided utility emissions, so from the combustion of biogas, avoiding the production of use of additional grid electricity. But other sources are the avoided fertilizer application and soil carbon storage. And in comparing the differences between curing and direct application, we can see that the bottom green box, soil carbon storage, is larger for direct application. This is due to the fact that some carbon losses occur during the curing process, so less carbon can then be stored after the digestate is applied to land. There's also a difference in terms of the process non-energy emissions. There's slightly more fugitive emissions of methane and N2O during the curing process than would apply if the digestate is applied directly to land. So next, we'll show the results for the dry digester. Again, this is the greenhouse gas results for each ton of material digested. So since the dry digester also accepts yard trimmings, we have results for food waste with curing and direct application, and yard trimmings with curing and direct application. The food waste results are similar to those shown on the previous slide. There's relatively minor differences between wet digestion versus dry digestion. And then for yard trimmings, you can see the option of curing versus direct application has a larger impact compared to food waste. And this has to do with the increased carbon content that is retained in the yard trimmings versus in the food waste, and how if when directly applied, there's much higher soil carbon storage that occurs from yard trimmings, which shows why there's a larger net emissions offset from yard trimmings direct application compared to food waste. And these tables, I won't go over in detail, basically showing some of the results I just presented, but these provide a summary of the net greenhouse gas emissions for anaerobic digestion of the different materials in WARM, both for greenhouse gas results and energy results. So these are available. You'll be able to consult this slide deck if you need to refer back to these. These results are also available in the WARM tool and in our documentation chapters. Okay, so now that we've covered anaerobic digestion in detail, I'm going to go through some of the other, quickly go through the other management practices available for organic materials within WARM. Food waste, for food waste, source reduction is an option. This was added in the past couple of years, and as I mentioned previously, it's modeled in detail for all food waste materials. So this includes beef, poultry, grains, bread, fruits and vegetables, and dairy products. This source reduction isn't currently applicable for yard trimmings in WARM. And in modeling source reduction, we strive to quantify the energy and emissions avoided by preventing the production of different food products. So some options for how you could source reduce food. When you're comparing to your baseline where you're generating waste that goes to a landfill, you can source reduce food by maybe changing your purchasing habits, better food management or refrigeration practices that prevent spoilage, so you don't have to order as much. These are ways that you can prevent the upstream demand for more food. And when we model source reduction, we're really capturing all of the energy emissions that are needed to produce those food products and get them to you to the point basically before they become a waste product. So this includes the energy from raw material acquisition and manufacturing processes, on the farm and all the way through processing and packaging, the transportation energy to get food materials to you, and then the non-energy emissions. So this could be refrigerants and then enteric fermentation for livestock, which can be some of the largest components of the upstream emissions for meats. Next is composting of organics in WARM. This is modeled for food waste, yard trimmings, mixed organics, and PLA, which is a biopolymer. The energy and emission sources for composting include the transportation of the composting facility, use of equipment at those facilities, and then some fugitive methane and N2O emissions that occur during the composting process, and then offsets occur from soil carbon stored in the land. We don't currently include a synthetic fertilizer offset for composting, mainly due to the lower nutrient value that's assumed to be in compost compared to the digestate coming out of an anaerobic digester. But this might be something we will explore in the future, as I'll talk about when we cover the organics module under development. And just to note on composting, this uses the same soil carbon storage model and assumptions that are used for land application of the digestate. So to create consistency between how those processes are modeled in WARM. Next, covering landfilling of organics. This is modeled for all materials in WARM. We have user options for different landfill gas recovery and moisture conditions at the landfill. The energy and emission sources are transport to the landfill, use of equipment at the landfill, and methane emissions generated from waste at the landfill. And the offsets come from carbon stored in the landfill over time, and also from net electricity offsets. So when landfill gas is recovered and combusted for electricity, similar to anaerobic digestion, there's avoided use of grid electricity. And for landfilling, we use the same material properties and electricity offset assumptions as for AD, again, to create consistency between AD and landfilling where it's appropriate. So this chart presents the results for these different management practices for organics. Showed them all side by side with food waste, yard trimmings, and mixed organics shown where appropriate. The AD results that are shown here we've already previously presented, so just showing the other management practice options side by side. As you can see, composting is for some instances comparable to anaerobic digestion. Landfilling really does vary by the material you choose. So for food waste is a very large source of greenhouse gas emissions. whereas for yard trimmings, they're due to the nature of the sort of woody biomass that's in yard trimmings. A lot of it is assumed to be stored as carbon within the landfill over time. And where that storage exceeds the methane that's released. And from our review, this is appropriate from a mass balance approach. As you can see, AD really does vary by some of the user options. And again, what we've shown here is national average grid assumptions. So if you were to adjust that, these results would change, depending on whether you had a more carbon-intensive electricity grid that you're offsetting or less carbon-intensive, the results would vary here. And then this next slide, just for perspective, I've shown the source reduction emissions for the average mix of food waste. So as you can see, when compared to the other practices, source reduction is by far the most beneficial option. So that is, a big reason why, EPA really stresses reducing waste as the best option rather than trying to manage it afterwards. So now that we've covered all of the organics management practices that are currently included in the WARM tool, I'm going to cover some of the more forward-looking efforts that we have going on. One of those is food donation. It's not currently, a management practice within WARM. It's sort of unique in that it definitely differs from source reduction. So source reduction, you're trying to prevent the generation of waste at the source and avoid the upstream production of waste. Whereas food donation, you're still managing existing food materials. It just so happens that they're not waste materials. They're still edible either for people or for animals. So you can donate them and still get value out of them rather than treat them like a waste product. EPA prepared a guidance document called Modeling Food Donation Benefits in WARM, and that provides sort of a quick way of roughly estimating what the avoided landfilling emissions would be. So if you were to donate food, someone was to consume it instead of sending it to a landfill to become waste, that document provides a way to estimate those benefits of food donation. But it's a rough estimate, and it doesn't account for sort of everything that goes into the food donation process. There's some consideration of losses during food donation, but there's really much more that can be done to model exactly how food donation occurs in the United States, and that's an effort we're currently working on and looking to add as part of the organics module. So then turning to the organics module, this is currently under development. This would be a separate standalone tool that would really focus on organic materials and the relevant pathways for organics. So if you've used WARM and thinking of it, there's a lot of rows, a lot of materials in there. Something like composting or anaerobic digestion only really applies for a handful of them. So the organics module is thought of a way of really focusing on these materials that are pretty unique compared to some of the other material groups in WARM, and focusing on those on a material basis, but then expanding some of the options in how you manage those materials. So we imagine this would be a bit of a redesigned interface. Would definitely follow the same principles of WARM. So you would be comparing a baseline management practice to an alternative, but it would be presented in a different way, and provide more options for the user so that you could better reflect how you're choosing to manage your organic materials. One of the plans would be to model food donation explicitly rather than have our current approach, which is just some guidance on how to avoid landfilling impacts. So this would go through the whole food donation process, starting with probably a focus on where the food was generated, whether it's coming from a farm or from a supermarket or from a restaurant, providing some information on what the process of donation looks like from that point, including any losses that occur, transportation that's needed, refrigeration that's needed. So we'll be going into more detail in the organics module to really capture what happens during food donation. And then also, one thing we're considering is additional user options, user inputs for anaerobic digestion and other management practices. So just to go over those in a bit more detail, the user options for anaerobic digestion that are under consideration include impacts from co-digestion. So as I said earlier, we developed the anaerobic digestion pathway worm for wet digestion with the idea that the methane yield would reflect, would be representative of both standalone and co-digestion facilities. But there are some potential impacts from co-digestion that we might not be capturing right now. So for example, if rather than combusting the biogas to produce electricity, you burned it for heat at a wastewater treatment facility, could have potentially different impacts. Other options we might look at would be different uses for biogas. So as I said earlier, you could upgrade it to pipeline quality natural gas or convert it to being a vehicle fuel rather than combusting it for electricity. So this might be another option we'll include. And then potentially also looking at other uses of digestate. So right now, we've only modeled application of digestates to agricultural soils, but there are potential other ways of processing them that we could include. And we certainly welcome any input from others there on AD practices that are growing or relevant. For food donation, we're looking to use data from major food banks to model national average practices. As I said, quantifying the emission savings from donating food, especially as it varies for different food sources, so whether it's restaurant, grocery stores, or farms, and then accounting for the transportation, storage, and losses during that process. And finally, composting, potentially looking to reassess whether avoided synthetic fertilizer offsets occur. As it's not currently part of the composting pathway, but that was based on a review of literature in previous years that showed that a synthetic fertilizer offset was unlikely to occur during composting, just mainly due to the lower nutrient value of the compost. But I think there's been recent literature that's indicated that a synthetic fertilizer offset may occur, so we may be revisiting that assumption as well in the organics module. And with that wraps up my presentation. So thanks so much for listening, and I think we'll have some questions now.
Thank you so much, Bobby, and thank you, Tiffany, for your presentations. We do have some questions, and I'm going to try to pull them up now. The first question that came up is probably perhaps for Tiffany. Do you have plans to include textiles in the tool in the future?
Textiles. So we have carpet right now, which is what we would use as a proxy for textiles, but we don't have anything specific to clothing, if that is what someone is thinking.
And do you have any plans to model the wider array of textiles in the future, or
it
not?
hasn't been something that has been raised. So a lot of times when we do updates, it is through requests from stakeholders and users. So it is something we could certainly consider. It is just not something that has come on our radar screen in the past. So.
Yeah, there's a lot of focus on textile collection and recycling, reuse, that kind of thing occurring, I think, at least around this region of the Northeast. So it's been a growing interest. I think that may be why that question came up.
Okay.
So there's several questions here, getting back to more of the presentations. One question is, wouldn't alternative landscaping be a version of source reduction for landscaping? Who wants to try to take that on?
I can tackle that. Is that, I'm guessing that's in reference to a potential source reduction pathway for yard trimmings?
Yeah. I assume
Yeah,
that that's coming from.
right. Yeah, I think there are some source reduction pathways for landfilling, or sorry, for yard trimmings. We haven't assessed them yet, and I think a lot of that has to do with lack of data or sort of the type of studies that we usually rely on for calculating factors within WARM.
Tiffany, did you want to comment on this at all?
I think Bobby covered it.
Okay. Okay, another question is, with regard to the growth of single stream, regrettably more paper is entering the composting stream because it is too contaminated to recycle. Is this accommodated in the model?
Currently, we don't have paper as part of our composting or as an option for composting. It is something we're hearing a lot more about, though, so I do think it is something we're going to have to start looking at a little bit further to see if the data is out there to support that potential addition for our composting category, but at this time, we do not.
Okay. The next question is, real-world experience suggests that 100% of donated food does not go to food. A significant amount ends up as waste again. I guess that's simply a comment. I don't know if you want to say much about it or respond to it. Do you have a sense of, is there any modeling that you've done or data you've looked at that says of the amount of food that is donated, what percent is actually consumed?
Yeah, well, I think in our sort of temporary guidance document on food donation, we do include some average factors that we got from the USDA loss-adjusted food availability data that does scale food donation by some expected losses that would occur in the process. But as we model donation in more detail, we're looking at data from food banks to capture the percentage of losses that occur. And yeah, I think it's our goal to try to account for those differences, knowing that some share of donated food is going to still become waste during the process.
There was a follow-up comment from the same person that said, my previous statement on food waste and diversion as donation is especially true for prepared foods. So I think that's a subcategory they're thinking about. The next question is, will you be holding a webinar on how to use WARM? Do you guys have any plans for that kind of thing?
It's something we have done in the past. Usually we have done it for state agencies, so states have requested that, so sort of a WARM 101 with some sort of guidance on how to use it as well as what's in it. So it usually, we don't have any specific plans on doing one, but we don't have a problem doing one if someone would like it. So.
Yeah, I guess if there's sufficient interest in that, this is Terry Goldberg from NMO. I'd like to hear that, and maybe that we could try to schedule something for the coming year on that. If we could coordinate with you guys, Chris, Tiffany, and Bobby, it might be something we can put on our schedule. So I'd like to hear about whether there is interest in that, in having a webinar on that.
And just as a side note too, on our WARM website, you will find a contact us. In that you can submit any questions you might have about WARM. So if you're working with it and you're finding that something's not working, like you don't understand why it's not calculating, or you're not quite sure what is in that particular material category or whatever it might be, please feel free to use that. Those questions actually do come to me, and I will either answer them myself, or if there's something that I think Bobby, should lend a hand on too, both of us will go through those. And so if you are using it and you run into any problems, don't feel like you need to wait for a webinar. Just go to that question box, and we'll, within the next couple of days, probably answer you on what to do there. So.
Great. So how does the source reduction model differ from an LCA model? I'm not sure which of you might be able to handle that. It's kind of a big question.
Yeah, I can cover that. So the WARM sort of takes the assumption of looking at waste from the point of materials from the point of waste generation, and it's a sort of a comparative tool. So meant to compare, a baseline practice versus an alternative. So for something like, if you were to say compare landfilling of a material versus source reduction, that does capture a lot of the stages of the life cycle, but they're just due to some of the constraints or just the idea that WARM is focused on end of life. There are certain stages of the material life cycle that we don't capture, mainly material use. So, for example, in source reduction of foods, we don't account for all of the refrigeration that might occur while a food could be in your home, or energy that's needed for cooking. So these are, especially because if you were to compare landfilling to composting, those would cancel each other out. So there are differences, and there are some life cycle stages that are excluded. So because of that, it's not meant to be a full life cycle assessment of every stage of the material life cycle.
Great, thank you. So sort of a follow-up on that is a suggestion to do life cycle assessment on donated foods and not stop at the food bank. But again, that you just sort of talked about the difference between the model and LCA model. So that's just a comment that one of the folks suggested. Another question is, are you considering adding biosolids as part of the organics waste stream to WARM?
I guess if that's meant to be biosolids from wastewater treatment.
That's what I take it to mean.
Yeah, I think WARM's focus is usually on municipal solid waste, and we do cover construction and demolition waste as well. So I think at this point it probably isn't a plan to add that. Or Tiffany, I don't know if you have anything to add if you've had other.
Yeah, I mean, I think once we start looking more at co-digestion, we might see whether that is something that becomes more applicable. But I think once we start diving a little bit further into the organics module, we would see whether that would be something that we would be doing or not. So.
Okay. The next question is, will you consider different transportation methods to the anaerobic digestion facility, say trucking versus sewer?
We haven't considered that yet. We have the option, the default for transportation in WARM assumes 20 miles transported by truck, but we do have the option to, the user can adjust the distance based on what might be more relevant for their practices. We haven't considered transportation by sewer. I think if that type of information is available in the literature, it might be something we could include as part of the organics module.
Next question is, which category, organic waste, will coffee grounds fall under?
That's a good question. I think I'd have to check whether we may have a reference to that in our WARM proxies document, which is available on the WARM documentation website, where we provide some guidance on which materials within WARM could be used as a proxy for materials that we don't cover. So yeah, I'd recommend checking there if we have anything, and if we don't, we'd be happy to either we could try to add that or follow up by email to make a recommendation on what would be appropriate.
And I always recommend too, if you are sort of hesitating on any particular material, our mixed categories really are kind of the way to go there. It's going to encompass essentially what you're looking at. So, I mean, mixed food waste for coffee grounds, I would guess would be like probably the best sort of default category at this time. I think we can look a little bit further into what our documentation says, but mixed categories will allow you kind of that. I'm trying to think of the right word, but yeah, I'm not coming up with the right word at this time. But mixed categories are usually where I would recommend people go to when they're not 100% sure what material category it might fit into. So.
Yeah, I'd say probably off the top of my head, the food waste non-meat would probably be the closest thing I would think of.
So there's a question here, why no source reduction for yard waste? Maryland counties have programs designed to reduce the amount of yard waste entering the waste stream. Those are source reduction activities, so it's kind of a combination comment and question.
Yeah, I think, again, this is, you know, we hadn't seen probably sufficient data to really model the different source reduction pathways, and I think this hadn't been as much of a focus recently as food waste has been. So mainly it's just probably if there is sufficient data and reports out there on the benefits of source reduction and how yard trimmings could be beneficially used and source reduced, then that could be something we could add in the future.
Tiffany, did you want to add anything on that question?
Yeah, I think, again, you know, kind of going back to that national average and really trying to represent what is happening across the country. I mean, we get a lot of studies that people kind of send us of things that are happening in small pockets of the United States or regionally, and we really need to be able to see that it is happening across. So if it is something that is becoming more common, I think we could certainly look into adding that as a particular category. But for right now, in the way that we have the model set up, but we do wait until we know that it is a national practice or a much more common practice.
Okay. So is this research potentially capable to support businesses that have cafeterias on site, or is that too small scale right now? If it is possible, what is recommended to use, or how would a company get started? Can they use the energy at their own business, etc.?
So I'm not sure I 100% understand that question. I mean, WARM is really to kind of help you decide what you might want to be doing with your waste. So if you wanted to try to take on composting or potentially buying less food, there's certainly the ability to compare that. It does do tons, so something smaller than tons is not necessarily going to give you great results within WARM. We do have our iWARM, our individual WARM calculator. At this time, we do not have food waste in that. But that is more of a small scale comparison. So we are working towards, and potentially within the organics module, we might have some ability to do less than tons. But it really is just to be used to kind of make decisions on, or not really decisions, comparisons at what you are currently doing with your waste and what you might want to do. But it's not really going to help you set up a program per se. So.
Okay. Can you please explain the significance of your consideration of the CO2 from AD as biogenic?
Yeah, I think it's consistent with, it was done in AD to be consistent with what we've done for handling of other organics materials in WARM. So I think, based on the idea that WARM is made to capture anthropogenic greenhouse gas emissions, and as they're also accounted for in other things like the U.S. greenhouse gas inventory.
Did you want to add anything, Tiffany, or comment on this?
Nope, that's good.
Okay. So I'm going to, there's somebody who's raised their hand for quite a while. I'm going to unmute them. This is Joseph Hadersbeck, and see if he wants to ask a question. Joseph, did you have a question or a comment?
No, thank you, though.
You don't have a question?
It was already answered.
Oh, okay. Okay, great. Well, does anybody else have any other questions? I don't see any additional questions or comments in the question box that people have raised. So if you want any questions or comments, please. Kristen Madden is asking, where do you find this again? Is the presentation available? Yes, we're going to be posting the presentations on the NMO website. At the beginning of the webinar, I flashed where that website is. I will send out an email with a link to where the presentations will be posted. As I mentioned at the beginning, I am we have recorded this webinar. We're hoping to post that as well, so people will have both access to the slides and to a recording of the webinar. So are there any final questions if folks want to? Bobby mentioned a warm calculator. I guess there's a question about where can you find that?
Yeah,
Go ahead.
okay, yeah, the spreadsheet version of WARM, which is the version currently available, is at epa.gov/warm, and you can download it from there.
So say that again, EPA.gov?
EPA.gov/warm, W-A-R-M.
Okay, great. So I'm not seeing any further questions this morning. It is morning, still morning here on the East Coast. So if there aren't any more questions, I think we'll begin to wrap this up. Again, I want to thank Chris Beeling, who's with EPA Region 1. She is one of the leads in the region who works on sustainable materials management, and she was instrumental in helping me to contact Tiffany and Bobby and set up this webinar. So I really want to acknowledge her contribution and her involvement in planning this webinar. Thank you, Chris. And in particular, I want to thank Tiffany and Bobby for your excellent presentations this morning and for taking the time to help prepare for this. So thank both of you.
Thank you.
So with that, we'll wrap it up today. Thanks, everybody.
Bye-bye.
Thanks, everyone.
Bye-bye.